Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to this series of talk that we have. I mean, this well-known people. We talk about the life research, and this time I'm very happy to have Professor Lenore Blum of CMU as a guest, and we talk about lots of exciting things. Just talk a little bit about, I mean, the way that I know Lenore. So first, I think Lenore is from the family of probably one of the most famous computer scientist family in the world, Manuel Blum, actually, who got the Turing Award, and Avrim Blum, that I had the pleasure to work with him on a few papers. I mean, he has also like very well-known computer scientist in learning. And I mean, he has both, like the whole family actually have lots of great students. So we can talk about all of this. And here we are talking with Professor Lenore Plum. This time, she is a AAA fellow and another lecturer, and lots of other awards that you can just see it on Wikipedia, etc. The way that I know her actually, when I went from MIT to CMU as a postdoc, she was one of the co-director of ALADDIN project. That was a very nice project. That I think that was some NSF program for a NSF project that got the grants from NSF. It was a long time project. She will talk more about it, and I had the pleasure to talk more with Lenore as well as Manuel and Avrim. So we will talk more about those things as well. So without further ado, I think we can start with Lenore. Do you want to have any? Start with anything to say hi?
So thanks for having me, Mohammed, on this program. So when you sent me a list of questions, and when I was thinking about this, well, you know, I'm older than many of the people you've had on the program, and I'm a woman. And so a lot of my professional life and my life has to do with really a history of women in STEM and into mathematics, computer science, and so forth over the past, now maybe 75, 80 years almost. So I thought what I would do is, I actually have given talks to a number of students, and I have some slides from that, and I thought maybe it would be fun to just go through some of those slides, because it goes through different periods of my life, and you can ask me questions as we go along. So would you like me to share my screen? I know this is very different than what you usually do, but I think this could be interesting also, an interesting diversion.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think that would be good, especially I think Professor Blum shared with me some of these photos. They are very nice photos. I think these are some lots of history in that. So we will have that at the same time we talk like others. So if you cannot, if it is a podcast, you can still listen to us, and we try to describe anything that we will talk. If there are some slides, then we talk about them. So we try to be useful for the people who cannot watch the video. But at the same time, I think there are some extra thing for the people who can watch it. Great. So I think we can start with that. So let me ask, I mean, I think like the first question that actually you have the answers. So I think we want to start from the beginning. How was the?
I always start with this slide, because.
Okay, so that's like yeah. Go ahead.
Even though you know, my career, because it expands this kind of almost generations, has these ups and downs. I think things for women haven't changed a whole lot. This is to contrast my husband's career, which was like almost straight and narrow, and many men I know, my colleagues, straight and narrow. But I think increasingly for most people, careers are going to have these kinds of ups and downs and detours and whatever. So this is my career. So it starts out a little bit, you know, you asked me about where I was born. Well, I was born in New York City, and here I am with my mom and dad. If you like, I can tell you a little bit. My dad he was in the Navy during World War II. He was stationed in the Pacific He had been a social worker before he went into the Navy. And my mom was a science teacher and taught high school science. In fact, she taught at the Bronx High School of Science. So there's my mom teaching.
Yeah.
Okay, so I grew up, in New York City with cousins around in a very Jewish area. So I hardly knew anybody who wasn't Jewish. It was somewhat of a, I wouldn't say academic enclave, but people had some college education and had intellectual aspirations. And I hardly knew anybody who wasn't Jewish at all, wasn't part of this community.
So, sorry, just asking a question. So I think your mother was a teacher. I think that was the whole idea of that later maybe transforming to being a professor. Did it have any effect, or what do you think?
Ironically, it was actually my dad who was most encouraging. And I think my mom, she grew up in a time when she and her sisters had to work hard during the Depression and afterwards. And I think she was thinking I should have an easy life. And why am I going and studying and all this? I think she was a little concerned about that. Why not just marry somebody and sort of have a nice suburban house? So actually, I think because of her upbringing and my parents both went through the Depression. So, but my dad was always very encouraging, very interested in what I was doing. So, and of course, my mom was too.
Yeah, and you didn't have any brother or sisters?
Yes, I have a sister. I had a sister who was 2 years younger. She wasn't born at this time.
I see.
Harriet. So she was a little more than 2 years younger than me. She's not
Great.
living. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think you can just continue, and then I will interrupt you for.
Yeah. So anyway, I lived with relatives close by and had a very happy childhood. Very, very happy. I went to school, public schools, which in New York at that time were very progressive. We didn't get grades, and so I never knew how I was doing, but really enjoyed growing up in New York. And then when I was 9. My family moved to Venezuela when I was 9.5. My dad had already moved, and we followed him to Venezuela.
So, any particular reason to go to Venezuela? I think that's important, actually.
Yeah. So this was when I went. It was 1952, and I think there were 2 major reasons we went. One was my dad had relatives in Venezuela. His sister lived there. And I think they thought that they could have a good career in Venezuela. But also, I don't know if you recall or you knew this in history, in the early 50s was a very political time in the U.S., McCarthy hearings. And since my dad had been a social worker and labor union organizer, and my mother was in the public school system, there was a lot of fright in New York about people, anything that you had to do that was socially involved was suspect. And many of their friends, I think, had been, sort of condemned. Some of them had been in what was called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which went to Spain during the Spanish War. So I think that partly because of the atmosphere in the U.S., and particularly in New York City, they went to Venezuela.
Great. So you had some, families before, like in Venezuela. That was, I think, that's my understanding as well.
We did have relatives there. That was how we knew about it, I think, Caracas, Venezuela. But for me, I thought I was really excited to go because it was so beautiful. Caracas, here we had lived in apartment houses in New York City and drab winters and all that. Even though I had a lot of fun and we were playing stoop ball, I did all the New York things. And in fact, when I was living in New York, before I was 9, I would take the subways into the city, go to museums by myself, which you would never let a little girl do today, but I had a lot of freedom. But when we got to Caracas, it was so beautiful. The city is between 2 mountain ranges. And it's just a gorgeous city, and with a lot of starting to have very modern architecture, because a lot of European Europeans came to Venezuela after World War II, many Jewish refugees, but also many Italians and Spanish were looking for jobs. And the Spanish and Italians were in the construction industry, and they were able to become the architects, and they developed fantastic architecture in Caracas, cantilever buildings. And so it was really a spectacular place. So for me, it was going from a black and white world to a technicolor world. And so the first year we were there, my parents put my sister and me into a Venezuelan school, partly because they thought we would learn Spanish that way. And so this was near the house we lived in. And after a few weeks, I just couldn't take the school anymore. It was very rigid. They had put me back 2 years because the system was so different, and that didn't stand very well with me. And we had to copy things that the professora put on the board. And then the principal of the school thought that he had the opportunity to teach very formally these 2 little girls, 7 and 9, Spanish. So he took us into his office and he would teach us the subjunctive case and all of that. And I had never heard about grammar in New York or the subjunctive case at all. And so I just didn't like school. I used to love school, and now I started hating it. And then the little boys, and I was thinking back what this was about, but they would say all the words they learned in English from movies. It's like, I love you and all this stuff. And I got so embarrassed. I told my mother, I don't want to go back to school. So actually, she took us out of school after 1 month. And,
yeah, good. So I think you were like 9 years old that when you moved from New York to Caracas. And so I think after 1 month, what did happen after the month?
So my mother, she didn't seem to mind. I mean, she was a school teacher, actually. So it's kind of funny. She didn't homeschool us. What we did, and this is showing you, I had such great time. She found out that if you took the bus from our house to the center of the city, which was called El Silencio, you could get buses to every place in the city that would take you there and come back. So we would take different buses every day we'd take the bus into the center and then take a different bus to tour Caracas. Every single day we sort of learned all about the city. And then at the end of the day, it turned out close to where we lived, there was a cafe, and all these European women would be there, and they had ice cream sodas, and they had European pastries, and we would end the day sitting around the cafe. So for me, it was such a glamorous year. That was my whole year.
So that was the whole fun year, essentially.
It was a whole fun year of exploring and not being at school. I did a lot of reading. Anytime I could find a book, I would read. And I think we might have belonged to an American Venezuelan library, so I was able to get books. So I read a lot. But at the end, so let me just tell you something interesting during this first year. So I start when I'm 9.5 in September, go to school, drop out, go on these things. And then in December, my mother knew this family, another Jewish family in Caracas, and we went over to visit them. And I was 10 by then, I think, in December. That's when I met Manuel. And he'll tell the story in a very romantic, glamorous way. He sees me come in and his eyes light up, and he's playing the piano and I'm playing the violin. We both played the piano and violin, and somehow he was actually older by 4.5 years. So you can imagine he was like 14, I'm 10. And he was going to military school. So he had his military school outfit on, I think. But anyway, that's when we first met.
So that's actually interesting. So that was, I think, he was like 14 and a half, you were around 10, and I think you get familiar with each other. And he was originally from Venezuela, correct? No family in US.
Yeah, so his parents had gone to, they came from Austria, Austria probably, Romania, actually. And his father's family was very poor. So his father actually went to Venezuela in the 1920s to make a living for himself. And his mother's family actually was quite well-to-do, and they stayed in Europe. But his mother and father got married. His father went back to Europe, met his mother, and they went to Venezuela I think his father went originally in 28 and his mother went in 37, right before, the war. But her family did not go. His father's family all left and went to Venezuela. So his uncles on his dad's side all went to Venezuela, but his aunts and uncles and cousins on his mother's side all went through the Holocaust. Fortunately, they survived. They were.
So, of course, I mean, they were. He was from a Jewish family as well, correct?
Yes, yeah, and his mother's family was fairly well-to-do, and many German and Romanian and Jewish families that were well-to-do felt, well, they're part of the community. Nothing's going to happen to them. They're established, whatever. And I think this happened to many prominent families. There's a movie about the Finzi Continis in Italy that felt that, they were very prominent, but that didn't save them at all. Though, of course, what saved them was they weren't in death camps. They were only in labor camps. So they somehow survived that. So after the war, most of his mother's family went to Venezuela too. So he had a pretty big family in Venezuela on both his father and mother's side when he was growing up. But he was born after his parents married. So he was born in 38 in Caracas.
I see.
So he's a Venezuelan citizen. He was a Venezuelan citizen. I guess he still is.
And are there, at that time, like a large Jewish community in Venezuela, or?
Yeah, there was. There was a Sephardic Jewish community that had come very early, maybe in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. These are basic Spanish Jews. This is not the Ashkenazi Jews, which are more Eastern European Jews. And those, they were pretty successful in Venezuela. Actually, Venezuela was very good at those times, very good for Jews. I mean, Jewish people. They were very accepted into the community. And what the Sephardic Jews did is they actually financed many of the Ashkenazi Jews after the war to come to Venezuela. And I don't know if you know that during the war, many, many ports were closed to Jews. Even the U.S. was closed. There were very few places where Jews could go to. It was very hard to get into the U.S. But Venezuela was very open to Jewish people coming, both before, during, if they could, and after the war. So it was a very, in fact, when we first went there, we lived in a Jewish community, very Jewish. It was San Bernardino. Manuel didn't live there, we did. But a very Jewish community with synagogues and Jewish schools, which were some of the best schools in Caracas, actually. So the Jewish community was, at those years, thriving in Venezuela.
I see. Good. So I think now, coming back to the story. So that was 10 and 14 and a half. So what did happen after that? So
he went back to school, and my parents had to decide where to send us to school after the whole year. We hadn't gone to school. So there was an American school in Caracas. And because in those years, Venezuela has a huge number of resources. And in those years, oil was the biggest resource. And the oil was pretty much controlled by American companies and British companies and Dutch companies. And so in those years, there were 70,000 Americans actually in Venezuela. And they supported schools and various things. But the schools, and if you worked for the oil companies, the school was probably nothing. But if you didn't, it was really expensive. So what my mother did is she became a teacher in the junior high school, a science teacher. And that's how we were able to go back to school. Right.
Good. So, and when at which age you married? I mean, Manuel, so
okay.
did you know each other and what did happen?
You want to come up to that. Let me just say one thing about this school, though. I became an American in Caracas. See, unfortunately, because of my experience, I didn't become so involved with the Venezuelan community in Spanish, but I became very involved with the American community because most of these people came from the West, from Oklahoma, Texas, California, Montana. they were real Americans that I had never known before. So I learned about American culture there, about Elvis Presley and rock and roll and all of the 50s things that people learned about in the US outside of this Jewish enclave in New York, which we come from. I became an American at Escuela Campo Alegre, and math and art were my favorite. In fact, what happened is when I went, I was excited to go back to school. And the very first day I went back, was fifth, they were doing long division, but they were using something like the Euclidean algorithm. And I thought, this is so fantastic. And I caught on right away. And after that, was the best math student at the school. And I just loved it. It felt so, and I did very well. So I don't know if I was a good student in New York because they never gave grades. But all of a sudden, I became a top student. I mean, at least my grades were top. I don't know if I changed over that year, but anyway, that's when I fell in love with mathematics from the time when I went back to school 10 and a half. And at one point, I thought that for a lot of mathematicians, being out of school for a year or two really turned them into mathematicians. But I think with COVID and all that, I have to recalibrate that because I think the kids out of school for a couple of years now are not going to turn into mathematicians.
Yeah, I think the approach that your mother took it also was interesting. So I mean, like maybe as a regular person, oh, you should go to a school, you cannot go there. Say very relaxed. Say, okay, let's enjoy the life essentially for a year. And I think probably that break even helped you to, become even more interested when you came back.
For me, yes, not so much. For me, it was fantastic. Not so much for my sister because, in fact, she was younger and this year she forgot how to read. She got a lot of things. So it was harder for her to come back in. So I think the age matters when this happens too. Okay. Anyway, I was very fortunate there. And nobody seemed to mind that I was best in math and best in lots of things. I was thinking about it was because I was sort of other. I was like the only Jewish kid in the class of these Americans. And they thought, well, maybe because she's Jewish, she couldn't help it. She just happens to be good in math. And so I took the pressure of all the other kids who were competing with each other. And they weren't competing with me. Anyway, I had lots of friends who didn't seem to bother anybody. But I was. And so for high school, many of the kids, because they went back to the US to boarding schools, but we didn't do that. And I went to an international school, which was actually a missionary school run by missionaries. And my math teacher was fantastic, but he was a missionary. And so I actually skipped a year and I was able to, even though I lost a year when I was 10 and I skipped a year in high school. So I graduated from high school when I was 16. But when I asked my math teacher, I wanted to study mathematics in college, and I asked him about it. And he said to me, all the best mathematics was done 2,000 years ago. Why would you want to go into mathematics? And so because I loved art, and there was such great architecture in Venezuela, I thought, well, I'll combine math and art, and I'll go into architecture. So there was such beautiful stuff. When I thought about it later, I realized he knew mostly Euclidean geometry and trig and stuff. So he assumed the math he knew was all the math there was. And so it wasn't prejudiced against me because I was a girl or anything. It was just, so I don't think I would have felt discriminated.
I think, it might be the case. Like, for example, my son is like, I think 10 years old. I think when he goes, or like my daughter is like in second grade, elementary school. I think if you ask them, probably also lots of this basic stuff that they will hear is just from 2,000 years ago maybe. And maybe like during the higher school, we don't hear that much of more advanced thing that has been done more recently. So if your knowledge is like more onto higher school, maybe actually this statement is not a incorrect statement for that amount of knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. So I didn't take it personally, or that he didn't say, because you're a girl, you can't do it. In fact, I think he was such a good teacher. I remember doing a trig class with him, and he would give these proofs. He was German, Swiss German, and he's the proof. And I remember I was sitting in the back of the class and just watched these, and I was thinking, oh, this is so beautiful. It's so beautiful. So I think, like a lot of people who go into mathematics, I think the idea that it's beautiful is something that attracts you, but also like it doesn't seem to have people's opinion, involved with it. No one's making an opinion. It's just there. I didn't realize till much later that there are fads in math, and some things are in, some things are out, and things change. But for me, the beauty and that fact that it just existed for itself, I just love that. So then when I went to, so when I graduated, Manuel came back so we had been writing together, letters. In those years, no kind of email or anything. We were writing letters back and forth, particularly my last year of high school. And I wanted to know where to go to college. And I had actually wanted to go to MIT. And I applied to MIT. And I didn't get in. I got this letter that said, every person as a freshman has to live on campus, and we only have 20 beds for women. And so, we're full. We're sorry, but you can't, we're just very sorry, but we don't have enough room. Of course, they didn't say the men that. Okay. And,
yeah, so that's actually quite interesting, because I think this kind of rejection from MIT, we heard actually from, we heard from David Carger, some of these previous lives that he added, or Madhu actually also mentioned it. So it was a common thing to get rejection. I think there was like graduate versus undergraduate, but that's interesting things. So, and I think you were applying there around the time that you were like 18 years old or something like this, and this picture is from that time as well.
I was 16 years old. Yeah, okay. I was really 6. I was just 16 when I graduated from high school.
Okay, so that's a bit, I think generally it is 18 years, I think, here as well, like in US, but...
Yeah, I was young. But I thought I was very mature and sophisticated and whatever. And I don't know.
How old you have been when you took this photo, the first date with Manuel?
This was after. So we hadn't seen each other for maybe the last time I saw him was 10. But my last year of high school, we were writing back and forth. And so he decided to come to my graduation. And this is one of our very first dates. That was the spring of 1959, maybe right after I graduated. So he came down, he went to graduation with me, and we were here at the restaurant. I don't think this could have been one of the graduation parties, I don't know, but there we were. And we spent the whole summer really together. What was kind of fun was there was an English bookstore in the Galipan on this main street, and we would go there every day. We would get philosophy books. And I remember Manuel had been studying Freud, and I was totally anti-Freud. Anytime he would tell me a Freudian thing, I would tell him why that was totally nonsense, and I'd give him another explanation. So that's how we spent our summers, which was really exciting because for me, my junior high and high school social life was mainly just parties and with people who didn't seem to have intellectual aspirations, which I actually secretly did. But I wouldn't let on. I was smart in school, but I wouldn't sort of let on. So Manuel was somebody I was always looking up to because I saw him more like me. And that summer, we sort of spent the time sort of getting together, but in a very intellectual way. So it was kind of interesting.
And, I think for the audience, I think that is interesting. So we are talking also, this is, of course, we are talking with Professor Leonard Blum, but also we talk about Professor Manuel Blum. He's like probably one of the world famous computer scientists. He has a Turing Award, and he's very well known because of his great graduate students and PhD students that almost, lots of people actually, grandfather would be Manuel Blum. So we are talking about him, and that's a very important thing to know from earlier life about that.
I think he's even the academic great-grandfather by now of a number of people. So, so he had just graduated from undergraduate, I guess, when I graduated from high school. So he was now going into a master's program, PhD program.
And the undergraduate was in Venezuela?
His was at MIT. So he came back. So he had gone to a military high school in the US, and then he went to MIT for undergraduate. And then he graduated and came just when I graduated from high school, and we spent the summer very much together.
I see.
Yeah. And in fact, you can see I look pretty tan there. We used to go to spend a lot of time at the beach. We used to go to the beach a lot, or on the other side of the mountains I showed you. And we used to, and I would go there, and we would bring a little charcoal broiler, and we would buy fish from the fishermen and cook our lunch. We had a lot. We really enjoyed ourselves a lot. Yeah, I did not get to MIT, so I got into Carnegie. At that time, it was called Carnegie Tech, and this is more or less what it looked like. This was Pittsburgh in the 50s or 60s. So this was in 1959. I went to, and I started to study architecture in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Tech. But unfortunately, architecture, very soon I realized architecture was not for me, because it didn't have the math I really wanted to know more. I love the beauty of math, and I love proofs, and the math that we were getting in architecture were really, stress and strain and formulas, and nobody cared about the math. They just wanted to get through it and learn the formulas, and it just wasn't for me. And the art part wasn't even the art that I really liked. It was like straight edge drawing, this and that. So the first year, and I became an intern during one of the breaks at an architecture firm, and I saw everybody's drafting up other people's plans. And it just seemed for me to not have the kind of depth of creativity that I was searching. But also my whole class there was interesting in architecture. Everybody except me came from families that were somehow related to architecture. So they were really passionate about architecture. Their parents were architects or in construction, and they all knew about Frank Wright and Taliesin West. They were part of the culture, which I wasn't. And so I didn't have the culture, and it didn't satisfy me intellectually.
To just add to that, my wife actually got her bachelor in architecture, a good university in Iran. So I'm familiar with that. And I think it's a bit different from math. So that is I think the type of architecture and math is the one that Eric Demane is doing nowadays. He's trying to somehow, maybe some aspect of architecture and the art and math. But generally, yeah, these two, seems very relevant, but maybe the way that it is taught is different. So, and especially as far as I remember, even now, architecture at CMU is a very good department. That's also,
Oh yeah, I think things are very changed today. It's, very much involved in the ecosystem with new materials, all sorts of things. Yeah, it's very different. But this was, late 50s. Also, even though a number of my students, it was actually fun to be in architecture, I must say. We were in the Fine Arts building, and we had the top floor of the Fine Arts building, but the first year classes sat in the first 3 rows where we had our drafting desk, and the second year sat in the next few rows, and the third and fourth year. So, and we worked all night. We really worked all night. So we got to know everybody, and it was a really fun community to be in. People, the upper division students would come and look at our drawings and give us comments. So as a community, it was wonderful. It was really something I really enjoyed. And when I went into math, that was something I really missed. When you're a math student as an undergraduate, oftentimes it's very lonely. And what this community in architecture was, was really wonderful. And having the classes all there, we got to know each other very well. So I got to know quite a few of the students.
And so I'm wondering, when you apply for MIT, I think for MIT you have done probably more engineering or math, correct? It was not architecture.
I applied probably for architecture because, as I told you, my teacher said not to go into math. So
I see. You took it very seriously.
So in 17, I decided to switch. I'm still young, I'm the most even entering student, but everybody told me no because, architecture was in the fine arts school and math was in the engineering school. And then there were real silos. How can you go from fine arts to engineering? So I don't think that, but here is a girl wanting to go from fine arts to engineering. Most of the girls in fine arts were in art and music or drama. They weren't in architecture, they were in these other fields. So here is a fine arts girl wanting to go into engineering, and everybody, Dean said no, everybody said no. It's really kind of discouraging. I mean, they even thought I should see a counselor. Well, why am I doing this? Whatever. So what happened is, luckily, I knocked on a lot of professors' doors, and I knocked on this one guy's door, and he said to me, I told him I wanted to switch to math, and could he help me? And he said, oh, yeah, you come into my class. I'm doing an experimental class. You missed some lectures, but that's okay. This computer we have will make it all up. Come in. So this guy, who turned out to be Alan Perlis, who turned out to be the first Stern Award winner, the first head of computer science at Carnegie Mellon, and then the first head of computer science at Yale, any first, actually. So I'm finding that people who are often first are more open to you than others. So he said, yeah, take his course. And they had recently gotten a 650 IBM computer, which was in the basement of the business school. It was called GSIA at the time, Graduate School of Industrial Administration. And it filled up the whole first president of ACM even. So it was first that. So we had the 650. That's not me, but that's a stock picture. And we had to program in assembly language in these cards. I don't know if you ever had that, where you're essentially writing ones and zeros, and you write down a program, and then you translate it over, then you type it in, and then you have a stack of cards, and hopefully at night you would bring them down to the computer room, and then they would see if they would compile, and you get piles of paper in the morning if it went through. If it didn't, you have to do this all over again. So but what was interesting is what Alan did was he would give us problems, often that were never solved, hadn't been solved at that time. So, the firing squad problem, when you have these little automata lined up, and one gets a signal, and then it has to be passed down through the whole line, and then they all have to fire at the same time. That problem, which I later give to my flat class, formal languages and automata or computing class, was not solved at that time. But he gave it to us. And whether we solved it or not, I don't know. We wrote these programs for that. Anyway, so it was interesting. He would give us a lot of very interesting problems. He was basically a numerical analyst.
Sorry, you are talking about Alan Perlis here, correct?
Alan Perlis, yeah. Yeah, actually, it's interesting. He wrote something about that class I was in later on, about his ideas. He's very visionary. He said in the future, every liberal arts student would have to know about computing. And he was doing this to sort of try to see how he could have a class that would be more open. On the other hand, and this is just when was this? This is 1960, 61. It was the time, I think I was the only girl in the class, again.
And how many other students? One out of how many?
Well, in this class, maybe 30. Another person who happened to be in this class, whom I didn't know at that time, was Jim Morris, who became our dean. He was in that class with me, actually. I don't think I was familiar with him. But what I did notice then was, in those years, there were mainly boys who became what were called hackers. That's different then. The word hack was different then than now. But these were people who would stay in front of the computer day and night, just trying out all sorts of things. And there were several guys in my class who would spend their days and nights in the computer room. And, were just attached to that computer so much. And they were like the original hackers, who really started to develop programming languages. An interesting thing about the programming languages we used, so Alan Perlis, when he was younger, when he was my teacher, he was a very lively guy. He wore sneakers and run back and forth across the room and talking all over. Later on, he became paralyzed, but in a wheelchair, but those years. And he liked to be very eccentric. And so he called his programming language, the assembly language, TASS, T-A-S-S, which was Tech Assembler or Tech Assembling System. Now, TASS, as you might know, was the Soviet and today actually the Russian propaganda machine. And in the 50s and 60s, that wasn't so popular to be promoting TASS in the US, but he called his language, the Carnegie Mellon programming language was TASS. 1961, Manuel and I decided to get married. Oh yeah. I should tell you something else about Manuel. At MIT, they didn't have computing classes. Carnegie Tech had a computer course before MIT did. But Manuel was working in Warren McCulloch's lab at MIT, and there were a lot of great guys in there, Shmuel Winograd and Jack Cowan and lots of others. So what I would do would be, anytime I would get interesting problems, I would send it to them, by mail, because, it wasn't like I could email them or anything. So they would actually do a parallel course at MIT.
Manuel, at that time, I think the time that you were at like a Carnegie Tech, he was at MIT and doing PhD in math, I assume, correct? Or electrical engineering.
Okay, so he started with a master's in engineering. As an undergraduate, as an undergraduate, Manuel took a year's course in Freud as an undergraduate.
Yeah, you mentioned.
And he ended up being, I think, the only student in the class. Because the class he really loved, and then he bought all 25 volumes or 30 volumes of Freud, like the whole thing. And when he was a junior, so his teacher, Schoenwald, who actually later became a professor at Carnegie Mellon, told him, well, now that he's learned about Freud, he should go and meet the anti-Freud, and that's Warren McCulloch. So when he was a junior, he went down and introduced himself to Warren. And Warren's office is in the basement of building 26 at MIT. So if you know MIT, every building has a number, not a name. So maybe now they have names, but 26. And so Manuel introduced himself to Warren, and Warren said, great, come in. And that's how he started working with Warren as a junior at MIT. And from then on until we left in 1968, he was with Warren. Warren was really his father, mentor, everything. So when we got married, we got married at the MIT chapel, and almost everybody from the lab, you can see it's pretty crowded up there. The MIT chapel is non-denominational. They have something that is like an elevator behind, and it brings up all the different religious things. If it's Jewish, they'll bring up a chuppah. If it's something else, it brings up something else. And so there they brought up a chuppah, but we had the whole lab up there practically, and with my parents and his parents and my sister and his brothers, the place was pretty crowded at the chuppah. But that's where we got married at MIT Chapel. And then we had
is it the same place? I think there is one cultural center that are all religion. They have a place there. Was it the same place?
You could look it up. It's a building that was built by an engineer. The architect was Saarinen, really famous architect. And it's a sort of a cylinder, and around the cylinder there's a moat. And it's very simple, cylindrical building, very simple. I don't know I think they probably have different denominations still. I don't know whether it's right where close to where Kresge Auditorium is, if it's still there. That also was built by Saarinen. But it's a lovely, if we were going to get married anywhere, there are always big Jewish weddings and Jewish after weddings and parties. We wanted something really simple. So MIT Chapel was fine, and then we had a little restaurant dinner afterwards, and that's Manuel's parents are on the left, and my parents on the right, and next to me is Warren, and you could see the twinkle in his eye. Warren was so wonderful. He always had this fabulous twinkle in his eye. And Rook McCulloch is his wife. She's sitting next to a wonderful woman who was sitting next to Manuel. And they're the only pictures we have, maybe, of Manuel without a beard. Our son has never seen him without a beard. So he looks very, very young. Even though he's 4.5 years older than me, he could even look younger than I was. So he was.
And so at that time, you have graduated from,
No.
got your degree from CMU or not yet?
No, I left after 2 years, and I was 18 then. Okay, so this is time people usually. So I didn't apply to MIT again because I was just afraid of being rejected. So I went to, so I moved there. I went to a women's college in Boston, Simmons College. Okay, and Simmons College was kind of great, and I'll tell this a little bit of the story later, but they paid for me to take courses at MIT. So I took this fabulous course with a guy called Iz Singer. I'll tell you a little bit about that. And then I applied to graduate school at MIT. I got in. Avrim was born while I was a graduate student. There he is. And what's interesting, how how did we take care of this kid when we're both graduate students? So
that's interesting. So like actually you were both graduate students at the time that Avrim was born.
Let's see. I think by then Manuel may have gotten his PhD and also been assistant professor. I can't quite remember, but because I don't. I'll have to look at the dates again.
Yeah.
I
So
don't
he got his degree in which department at the end?
Well, he got his PhD in math.
He got it in math.
In math, in I think 1965.
And then he became assistant professor in the math department as well. Correct?
In the math department, yeah. Which I think had problems for him, but because his home was really with Marvin and also who was his advisor and Warren mostly, and Warren's office was in the basement of building 26, and Warren's office was open for everybody. He was there all the time. And there was a little office connected to his, right next to his, a small office that Manuel had. And so, there wasn't childcare then. There wasn't anything like that. And in fact, in those years, as a woman, if I were working, I could have been kicked out for being pregnant. I could have been fired. MIT could have kicked me out as a graduate student. I mean, all these things. I even told Manuel until 1975, I couldn't even have a credit card in my name. So there are a lot of things that were, the idea of having maternity leave, no, not at all. And I saw one of my colleagues here at Carnegie Mellon the other day and told me he was on paternity leave. My God, paternity leave. We didn't even have.
Yeah, so that's actually interesting. We are far from now. In 1975, you are talking about that. There is no concept of paternity leave that you can take out. I'm talking
about a little earlier, actually, because when I started graduate school, it was 1963.
1963. And even, what was the credit card? You couldn't have credit card like.
Right, things were in your husband's name. You had to get permission to do things. I wasn't so aware. I think I had blinders on and didn't pay attention that this was discrimination. You see, I think what got me through all these years was having blinders on. You see, if you do, then you don't take anything personally. Well, of course, it does seep in, but you sort of can get through the day pretty much without saying, oh, why, this is not fair. How come they can kick me out? How come I have to pretend I'm not pregnant? How come, whatever. I remember my first maternity dress ever that I wore was the day of my oral exams. And the guys didn't even notice I was pregnant. And they kept on saying, wow, Lenore, you're looking nice. You're wearing a dress. And later on, I told, which I'm not sure they should have commented on or not, But later on, I told Avrim, I said, Avrim, you have an unfair advantage. You're going through your oral exams twice. You already went through it with me. You were prepped already. So
yeah, I think because he also got his, PhD also from MIT. Also, his bachelor was from MIT. That I don't remember.
Yeah, so he was an undergraduate in math at MIT and then a PhD in computer science.
Okay. Yeah.
So when we were there was no computer science. It was just electrical engineering. You know, there was before it was the ECS. It was just EE. So, right. So this is.
So the whole family there, got graduated from MIT. That's also interesting.
Yeah, we did. In fact, I'll show you some other pictures of more of the family. But the way we handled things was Manuel had this office in the basement of 26 right next to Warren. And what we did is we set up a little bassinet for Avram there. And we had this kind of, they didn't have car seats then, but something that was something like a car seat for him to be in. So he spent his first year or two in the basement of building 26, except I had an office in building 2, which was the math department. So he would go back and forth between the different offices. And he was spent his first couple of years at MIT. So I told him
I had an office in the math department. That was before this renovation. That was 2001 because we went there and it was the basement, no window, nothing really. It's like all black floors. It was quite actually frustrating when I went there. Later we could get an office in the CSAIL, and that was much better. LCS and then CSAIL. That was much better. But yeah, the old buildings were not that great, I will say. Especially you go to the basement and have it for a child.
Well, actually, when I was a graduate student, it was before they did any moving of graduate students. I was actually on the first floor of building 2, right next to Norbert Wiener's office. So there were 4 of us in the office, graduate students, but we had a nice office.
Okay. So. But I think you were not in the basement. You were in the higher.
Well, yeah. You know, later on, they moved the graduate students to another building. Then they probably moved them back to the basement. I don't know. But the first years, I had a very good office there. So Avram spent a lot of time there. And also, I was nursing him at home. But, you know, we also were feeding him formula. And we were able to get, it was really interesting, formula that was already prepared in a can. And you could stick a nipple in it. There was a way to stick it in, and he could hold it, and it looked like he was always drinking beer. People would come by and see this kid holding a beer can, drinking it. It was really funny. I don't have any pictures of that, but I do remember that very, very startling. So, in a way, that gave Avram a heads up too, or a foot up, or whatever you want to say, because being born essentially at MIT, in fact, I went right from being a TA, grading papers at the end of the year to the hospital. Being born there, spending his first years there, meeting all these people, he was demystified about the place. So the scary thing about MIT for many students is when you're first time there, like, you know, it's your first experience at this great place with all these great other students, and it's kind of scary. But Avram had the advantage. I think he knew a lot of the professors because they were just friends of ours, friends of his. So I think he did have, he was a great student, no doubt, but I think he did have a little bit of psychological advantage because he was born.
To this competitive environment of MIT, that if you don't know, it's like a bit frightening at least, as I heard even from other people.
Yeah, so he was coming home. That's where he's born. Yeah. You know, so I think that helped a lot. So let's see what I had. Oh, my PhD thesis. A lot of things I've done in mathematics sort of bridge 2 different areas. And I was able to use some new techniques in mathematical logic that were starting to be developed in the 60s to solve questions about differential equations.
Great. So who was your advisor?
Let me give you a little background because these people are very, very important in my life. So MIT was much more complicated than it seemed to, when I'm making it out to be. So when I was at Simmons, the woman who was head of the department, the math department, who was also my teacher there, Marion Walter, she said to me, like, we don't have, all the courses we have, you've gone through everything. We can't give you any more. I'll get you into MIT. And Simmons paid for that. And I was able to take a course given by Singer, Professor Singer, in algebra, a whole year course with him. And it was exactly the course I was looking for my whole life. It was, it was deep, it was beautiful, it was the most beautiful. It was an algebra and linear algebra, but no equations. It was all theory, which I loved. And it was, he was really doing his own research, but he would come in and give these fabulous lectures. And I did really, really well in that class. So I loved the algebra. It's like, I finally found what I was looking for. And what's interesting to me when I think back is I didn't know how I knew that was what I was looking for, but that's what I was looking for. A really fabulous pure math course from a fabulous research.
Sorry, this course was at MIT, correct? Or
MIT. It's an undergraduate course at MIT. Yeah, and I did really well in the A's and all that. But when I applied to MIT as a graduate student, then I had to go for an interview with the head of the department. And when I went, and that was, I think, on the third floor where the department head was, or the second, I think it was the second or third floor, I don't remember exactly. So I went into his office, almost the corner office, and the moment I come into his office, he hands me a sheet of paper, and he says to me, if I had a daughter, these are all the schools I would suggest she apply to. MIT is not a place for women. This is what he's telling me in my interview. MIT is not a place for women. So you can imagine, here I did really well in these math courses all along at MIT, very hard. I was, really great, all that. I didn't ask for recommendations from Singer or anything because I was maybe too shy to do that. But so I really felt devastated. But a lucky thing.
And that was the department head of MIT that mentioned that to you.
Or the head of the graduate program, yeah, who said to me that. Yeah. So you can imagine how devastated I was. First I'm told I can't get in because they have no beds for women. And then I'm told I can't go in because it's not a place for women by a math head. So luckily for me, sort of luckily, like I had met Alan Perlis, luckily there was a party of math faculty that weekend. And they were joking about this girl. Here I'm married, right? And they're joking about this girl who's applying to the graduate program in mathematics. Actually, I was pretty young then too. I was about 20 then. And why they would joke about me anyway, I don't know. But Singer was there, and he wanted to know who they were talking about. And they gave my name. He says, oh, Lenore Blum, she's the best student in my class. And we have 150 students in my class. I got accepted the next day, okay, because of Singer. So he became like my mentor and he was like, he died a year and a half ago, which is very sad, but he's in his 90s, but a fantastic person. But in a way, the trouble with that and the trouble with lucky things like that is when I started MIT, I thought what I would do to show them that I was very deserving. And also because I wanted to take some good math, I started taking 8 courses as a graduate student, 8 graduate courses. Can you imagine taking 8 graduate math courses? Manuel never took more than 1 or 2. Here I'm taking 8. So of course you.
So you mean in one semester you took 8?
Once the first semester. Nobody told me not to do it. I just was going to show them. But of course you can't do that. And so I would drop one course after another. I ended up with 3, but that was so devastating to me that I was doing that the first semester was like, oh, I was going to show them I would do it, but.
The 8th one, yeah. The 8th is hard. I took it I think 3, maybe 4, but not, 8 is hard.
So let me tell you a little bit more. These are people who are important, like graduates for my PhD. So let me tell you a little bit about this. Because I'm a Singer's course in algebra, I was really interested in studying in algebraic number theory. So I started working with Professor Iwasawa, Kenkichi Iwasawa, who's a very famous number theorist. And he was my advisor, and I was doing a PhD thesis in algebraic number theory, in group representations, integral group representations, things like that. And that's what I took my oral exams in. Right. As soon as I finished my oral exams, it turns out that Professor Iwasawa left MIT to go to Princeton. And in those years, Princeton would not allow women in the math department. So there was absolutely no way I could move to Princeton, even if I wanted to. It wouldn't be hard for me to do that, but even if I wanted to, I couldn't do that.
Which year was that?
That was maybe around 65, 66.
And was it like some, policy that they implemented or written even somewhere?
This was Princeton until 1968, which is the year I got my PhD. Princeton would not let women into the graduate program in mathematics.
Yeah, but so this was the policy that was written somewhere, or it was something that they were just implementing it?
It was implemented in 68 when they became.
No. But was there any written policy that we should not give any admission to any female students? Formally?
I think so, probably, and it was legal, sure. They were like, yes, nobody challenged it. Anyway, I couldn't go to Princeton. So here I'm devastated again. Here I'm working my thesis, practice my exams, whatever. Luckily, what happened is Hartley Rogers was teaching a course in model theory, modern model theory course. And I don't know if you knew about Hartley Rogers. He was an amazingly wonderful teacher. He wrote the book on recursion theory, but he was learning model theory and he was teaching it, and he asked me to be his TA. So by being his TA in that class, I learned a lot of model theory, and I learned about really new techniques in logic called saturated models, ultra products, and how people were using some mathematicians, logicians at Cornell, Axe and Cochin, who are pictured here. There is left here is Jim Axe, and then there's Simon Cochin. And they were applying these techniques to solve problems in algebra. So there was a conjecture of Artin that the certain homogeneous forms of a certain number of degree would have a solution over the p-adics. So what I liked about ultra products, they were sort of like local, global. If you took an ultra product of p-adics, you had some kind of global thing, but each product piece was local. Anyway, it seemed really, the work they were doing was really fascinating. And by showing that the ultra product over a non-trivial or non-principal ideal of the p-adics over all p was isomorphic to the ultra products of these power series field over FP, the finite field of p elements, that those two fields were being isomorphic, those two ultra products were isomorphic, so they could translate results back and forth. So since this result was known for the power series field over these finite fields, they could translate those results over the p-adics for all but a finite number. So for any system, any form of a certain type, if it had a solution, it would have a solution for almost all p. That's what they could show. But they couldn't show for almost all but a finite number. They couldn't show for all, and it was really exciting that several years later, somebody showed that they gave the very best possible answer to the question, because it wasn't true for all p, just for almost all p. So anyway, I got really excited about using these techniques, new techniques of ultra product saturated models in the number theory that I was doing. And I started to learn what they had done, which I thought was really gorgeous material. And
so actually, let me ask one question. So these are actually quite, more like advanced algebra that you were, talking about. Did you talk with Manuel on that? Has he done research on that one, or what was his take on that?
In fact, I was talking to him the other day. It was kind of interesting. I'll mention this soon, is the people I was working with, and that's my advisor particularly, were not very enthusiastic about Manuel's work in complexity. So when I started doing this work at MIT on looking at the ex-coaching work, trying to combine algebra and logic in this very sophisticated way, I was the only person at MIT in the math department who was doing that. So I was giving lectures on it. So anybody who wanted to know about it would come to my lectures. And my advisor, this person who, I am skipping his name, Gerald Sachs, became a new professor at MIT, and he asked me to be his student because he wanted to learn this stuff. Now, Gerald Sachs was well known in higher recursion theory in the sense that he had just written a book on degrees of unsolvability. So he was looking, when there are unsolvable problems, and there are more unsolvable problems, and there are higher degrees of unsolvability as you go up. That was his forte. And when Manuel started working on finite problems and complexity, he thought, well, finite problem, that's not interesting. That's too simple-minded. And so he was pretty scornful, as many logicians were, of complexity theory in those years. And as you know, a few years later, Cook didn't get tenure at Berkeley because they didn't see any future to his work. So he was in the logic group at Berkeley. So in those years, the logicians had a very low opinion of complexity theory.
So essentially, you are talking about Stephen Cook didn't get tenure at Berkeley, and I think he moved to Toronto maybe at that time as well.
He did.
Yeah, and then because I think they didn't appreciate that much the theory of computing and something.
Yeah, a lot due to my advisor, who was starting to say bad things about complexity theory and getting a whole group of people against it too. So that was very tough on me, that the person who was so interested in what I was doing was very negative on what Manuel was doing. So it was really, on the other hand, as I told Manuel, his colleagues, they weren't very nice to me. All of them were nice. Marvin, Warren, even I remember, others even gave me math books, but nobody seemed to be very interested in what I was doing. So I was just like, okay, she's the math grad student. Okay, we'll leave her there. We're doing this other stuff. So we didn't have much overlap in what we were doing at all. I was working this number theory logic in the math department. And even though Manuel was then eventually in the math department, he was in the applied math group, which was having some connections with ECS, but it was applied math, not pure math. I was in the pure math group. There were all of these groups that were sort of like pure math versus applied math, and who would look down or up on others, I don't know. But it turned out that the group, I would say, particularly my advisor, Gerald Sachs, was the key person. So that was very hard on me. He was really excited about my work. He learned from me. He was my advisor. I was in there every week, giving him lectures. That's how I got started and what I was doing. And in fact, I was once at a math meeting, and he introduced me to this guy here on the bottom. That's Anil Narod, who's a logician at Cornell. And Anil Narod was really like a wonderful person who gave me more advice. And he told me I should meet this guy, Manuel Morley, who's right here, over here, who had done some work that was called categoristic.
Yeah. Actually, when you put his picture there, it was quite familiar with me, because I actually talked with him later, and I'm actually proud we have this Naroda Prize that it is on his name, and we got that one because of the work that we have done. So it's like, he's actually a great guy, and talk.
Yeah, so I learned his work, and then I combined the two, the work of the kind of stuff Access Coaching was doing with the kind of stuff Morley was doing. And actually some old-fashioned work, which I called old-fashioned at the time, of Abraham Robinson, who had actually done a lot of really cool work in model theory, but it wasn't part of the new kind of saturated model theory type of thing. But I was combining all of these different kind of methodologies together and getting a very generalized algebraic theory, model theory. And then one day, Abraham Robinson comes to MIT, and I tell him about what I'm doing, and he says to me, gee, that looks very interesting, but it's certainly not going to work for differential fields. And I didn't know about differential fields at that time. So I got pretty upset and worried because what I was doing worked for algebraically closed fields, algebra fields, and algebraically closed fields, ordered fields, real closed field, valued fields, and maximally valued fields, whatever. And he's giving me an example where my theory wouldn't work. So I remember feeling really upset. And I told Jerry Sachs, he says, oh, that's so exciting. That's so exciting. I said, oh, I didn't find it that exciting. But what I did is I went and learned everything I could about differential algebra. And it turned out it did work. And actually it fit very well into my theory, very well. And in fact, I was able to get several things that he said couldn't happen. So for example, that there's something called model completeness. So you have the theory of fields with characteristic 0 and the theory of algebraic closed fields with characteristic 0. Algebraically closed fields are the model completion of fields. And then you have the theory of ordered fields, and then you have the theory of real closed fields. And the theory of real closed fields are the model completion of the theory of ordered fields, real ordered fields. Okay, and then you have these differential fields. And he had had an idea that there would be something like differentially closed fields, but he had no clue about the axioms. He said, so with algebraically closed fields, what's very nice is they have very simple axioms. You say if every polynomial of one variable has a solution, that's all you have to say. It's one variable axioms. You don't have to say every polynomial system that has solutions in some extension already has a solution. All you had to say was polynomials in one variable. Same for real closed fields. All you had to say was real closed if every positive element had a square root and every odd degree polynomial had a 0. And those were all one variable. Once you had the solutions for one variable, you get all solutions. But that wasn't true for differential fields. He says it couldn't be. And I think he had the wrong idea. He thought that you say every differential polynomial had one variable had a solution, and that wasn't enough. So I was able to get very simple axioms. I said they're pairs, P, Q, as if the order of P is greater than the order of Q, there's the solution to P that's not the solution to Q. Very simple one variable axioms. And from that, I was able to prove a lot of theorems. And it fit into my theory, and it fit into lots of things. And that's why my thesis became very well known, because I was combining all these things, and I was able to get some really new results.
But so was there any computation aspect in your thesis as well?
No. So in those years, I was really influenced by these guys that, in fact, I could get, in principle, just from the model theory alone, I could tell you that there was elimination of quantifiers. But I couldn't give you an efficient method. I could give you a theoretical proof that there was elimination of quantifiers. I could give you that certain differential polynomials were solvable without giving you the solution. I could show lots of things. So I was in the pure method thing there, and I really liked that you could show just theoretically these things would happen without having to do the actual computations. So,
actually, everything that. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think now, of course, everybody's interested in computations, as am I. But in those years, I was very persuaded by the more pure math kind of mentality or sensibility, which I really liked.
Actually, I mean, I was talking also with some other people. Like, I was reading this paper by Jack Edmonds. I think that was around 1960. He obtains actually the first algorithm for matching, and not just even unweighted graph, or not for unweighted graph, for weighted graph. That algorithm is still, I think, one of the most complicated problems that we know how we can solve in polynomial time. And it was interesting that at that time, when he mentioned the paper, I think at the beginning of the paper, he tried to say to mathematicians why this thing that I'm doing efficiently is important. Because for them, okay, you have a finite graph, just try all possibility and find the maximum. Why do you want to find an efficient algorithm?
Exactly, and that's exactly the argument my thesis advisor would give against complexity theory. Exactly, and that's why they poo-pooed it. Really, they didn't understand the depth of it. They really didn't understand the depth. And so it was, in a way, intellectually, or even in terms of mathematics and what we were doing in those years, Manuel and I were in different groups that actually appreciated different things. And in fact, I don't think he knew very much about my thesis actually at all, because he was, wasn't his sensibility or anything. So it's really interesting. We were totally on different wavelengths then, very different wavelengths.
Yeah, so I think this idea that you mentioned, you were discussing Freud versus not Freud. Now you had computation versus not computation.
Yeah, so I was very steeped in the math culture, and where that was coming from, because of course here I'm one of the few women in the department. Few things. I mean, my mother was a science teacher, but she certainly wasn't a mathematician. I didn't know anybody. I hadn't, except for proofs in trigonometry, I hadn't earlier on, known a whole lot. But I sort of felt that this is what I loved, and I did. And I would have actually continued with this, except that I went to Berkeley. Here's the first thing of my thesis, the model theoretical approach.
Math, and then from there, so you got your PhD, and Manuel was still, assistant professor at MIT, correct?
Yeah, so he was and I think because he was in the applied math group at MIT. And again, I think he didn't find that such a great home for him. So when I got my PhD and we had the chance to go to Berkeley, for many reasons, it was a great place for him, and I thought it would be an okay place for me. See, everybody loved my thesis. They came from Cornell, they came from Harvard, they came to hear it. I thought wherever I go, I'm doing some great work, people will appreciate it, and I'll have a community there. I did not realize the importance of going to a place where people really wanted you to be there and they were supporting you and loved your work. So, Abraham Robinson had offered me a position of assistant professorship at Yale, and we didn't take it because Berkeley was better for Manuel. But, for me, he was somebody who really wanted me because I had really started to put his work in the modern framework. We didn't. So I went to Berkeley. So let me just say something about 1968. It was the end of an era for them. I mean, these two guys were assassinated, Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King in 68. So it was really an end of an era at that time. But it was also a beginning in the 60s. It was part of revolution. There were revolutions in Berkeley, there were revolutions in Prague, Paris, Chicago, all over the world. But for me, the biggest revolution was the year when I graduated. Princeton allows women to apply to its graduate program in math. So I couldn't go to Princeton before that. But that year, 1968, that was the big revolution for me.
Yeah, I mean, it seems, to me, it's like, I don't know, 200-300 years ago, or like 1,000 years ago. So I think it was like, I don't know, something like 55 years ago or something like this we are talking about then. You couldn't even apply. That seems very weird. Like now, how can I have two daughters? How can I tell them that you cannot apply? They don't even consider you. Very bad, actually.
Right. So that's the world I lived in. In fact, they actually once accepted a woman with a Japanese name and they didn't realize it was female. And I think she finally didn't go or something, but that was like a little aberration on their part. So, yeah. So here we go in 1968, we go to Berkeley, the other three of us. And students at Carnegie Mellon, the women students, love this picture because they were able to say for many years, here are 3 Carnegie Mellon professors in one picture. And we became hippie-like, and you can see there. This is actually a picture taken in Latvizada's house by Latvizada, who was a good photographer.
Yeah, I mean, he's actually from, like, I think he's from Azerbaijan and from Iran. So that's like a well-known person, actually. It's like fuzzy logic. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So this was in his house in Christmas. So
he passed away a few years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, quite a long time ago. Oh, here you go, Avrim. I wanted to say that here's a picture of Avrim when we were in Berkeley. He had a little garden, and one day he came home with a cabbage.
Huge cabbage.
Anyway, that's Avrim when he was little. Okay, so let me tell you what happened when we went to Berkeley. Okay, one of the reasons I wanted to go there, well, for a lot of reasons, but Julia Robinson, who was a well-known logician who actually had combined logic and number theory and mathematics together, and she was working on, as you know, Hilbert's 10th problem, whether or not you could, given a Diophantine equation, or system of Diophantine equations, those are equations with polynomial equations with integer coefficients, whether or not they had an integer solution, and if you could decide whether or not they had it. She had been working on that for a number of years, but she had done very many other things in model theory and logic. So I thought, wow, great, I can go there, and at least she would understand what I was doing. But when I got to Berkeley, I found that even though she was very famous and she always signed her papers, Berkeley, California, she was never on their faculty. Which was, the light went off. Playing music now, I'm not playing music, but the light went off. That very soon I realized that things weren't going to be what I thought. So so I became a lecturer at Berkeley. I was there as a postdoc the first year, and then I became a lecturer. When I didn't take the position at Yale, they convinced me that this position would be as good as Yale, but in fact it wasn't. So one year, it was fairly clear I wasn't going to get tenure. I was getting on the track there. So it was a time of a lot of social things going on, and the math department was pretty socially active, and they had a colloquium series on social responsibility. And Steve Smale asked me to do something on women in mathematics. Now, you have to understand, until this moment, I got to Berkeley, and I noticed these things. I was never identifying myself as a woman mathematician. I always had blinders on. I never even thought about things. You have to go to places where you have mentors, where you have groups, that there are things against women. I just didn't pay attention to any of that, which got me through. But so I told him, I said, I don't know anything about women in mathematics. I don't know any history or anything. So I got together some people who knew something about it and put together a colloquium. And that was very well attended. So one woman who knew a lot about the history of women in mathematics, the first time I ever heard about Hypatia. I had heard about Sonia Kovalevsky and Emmy Noether when I was a graduate student, but in a very derogatory way. I heard the joke when I was a graduate student several times, both by the head of my department and by a very well-known young mathematician, telling me that there were only 2 women in mathematics in the history of mathematics, but one wasn't a woman and one wasn't a mathematician. Can you imagine telling such a joke to me? And I didn't realize how horrible that I later on found those were the 2 most famous mathematicians of the last century. Emmy Noether, they were saying wasn't a woman, and Sonia Kovalevsky, who talks about the celestial bodies and whatever, wasn't a mathematician. So they were putting down, by joking, not taking seriously, 2 very famous mathematicians who happened to be women. Okay, so this is the first time I heard more about them and what they had done. So because I ran this, I became known as the expert, the capital THE, on women in mathematics, at least on the West Coast. So before this colloquium, I knew nothing. And afterwards, I became the expert. And so all the women graduate students congregated around me, and everybody kept asking me advice and things. And so I had to learn about a lot of things. I became very involved with women in math. And in 1971, the Association for Women in Mathematics started. I was one of the founders of it. I became the third president of it. The chapter on the West Coast was the first chapter of AWM. So we started this professional association of women mathematicians, and that's when I get much more involved. And that took over a lot of my life for many years. Here's a thing that was one of the first issues of Ms. Magazine. And I think this happens today for women, but then we had to do everything. You had to be the wife, the mother, the caretaker, the professor, or whatever. You had to do it all. And that was our life. That was called the second war.
Yeah, actually, when you say, this one, the history, now I appreciate actually, or I don't say appreciate, actually the fact that, we didn't had any, women who got Fields Medal, I think now makes much more sense. Like 1968, they didn't even allow women to apply to Princeton math department. So then, that is like complete nonsense. Now you will consider it. And of course, it takes, several years to, have the culture. And it was even the culture against having women in math. So that's like very, absurd, I can say.
Right. So the 70s actually were a time, actually much more so than now, quite frankly, of a lot of feminist activity. Whether it made a difference, I don't know. But in fact, Title IX was signed by Richard Nixon in 1972. And it wasn't about sports. It was about prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in federally funded education programs. So it got sort of harnessed by sports, but it was for educational programs. And then in 74, Congress passed the Women's Educational Equity Act, which put a lot of funds into programs. In fact, I got a lot of money from them to start programs to get more women into STEM areas. This doesn't exist anymore. So in 76, they appropriated $6 million. In 2010, they appropriated $2 million. I know this is different. These are the amount of money. In real dollars, that $6 million in 2010 would have been, what, 60 million? I don't know that. But you could see how the government, in at least the early 70s, was actually starting to pay attention, but the whole thing collapsed, really. So a lot of work that we did in the early 70s just really went into hiatus for many, many, many years. I actually went to this women's college, Knowles College. I went as a visitor the first year, and I wrote a proposal saying that they should have a math and computer science department, which they didn't have. And they made me head of this new department. So I was the first computer science department at any women's college on the planet.
Yeah, so actually, also it is interesting. So again, that you will see that, okay, maybe we are much more advanced now. It's like 2022. The change at least the things from, 1968. But now you will see essentially this, abortion things, Roe versus Wade things that now happen in 2022. And it is again, we are back 50 years back.
It's
like
terrible.
Amazing, essentially.
I know, it's sort of incredible. So I became very much involved politically and actually in terms of doing educational programs, both at Mills. We started the computer science department. And then I worked starting something called the Math Science Network with Nancy Kreinberg, who was the Lawrence School of Science. And I was working at the college professional level, and she was working at the elementary, middle school, high school level with teachers. And we had a lot of similar ideas. So we became co-directors of the Math Science Network. And what the Math Science Network did is, the main thing was we had these conferences for middle school girls where we'd have hands-on activities in math science for girls, and they'd have role models at these conferences. They would meet women who were successful in different careers. So we wanted these girls not to do things differently, but to have the opportunity to actually experience science, experience math, and also see women who had been successful, whom they never met, and also interact with girls who had similar interests. Oh yeah, I won't show this film, but in 1975 or so, I made a film called Math Science Connection, and I re-edited it. It's a short film now, 20 minutes. So look at Back to the Future on my LinkedIn page, and there's a link to this.
Yeah, Back to the Future, and then they can find this connection.
But yeah, in the 80s, something happened that helped change my life, get me back into some mathematics more deeply again. And I had been in the 70s on a NSF committee, which is called CEOS. And one of the things that we proposed, that I helped propose in that committee, is that many women were working at colleges, undergraduate colleges, where there's heavy teaching load and very hard to do research when you have heavy teaching load. So that we would have fellowships for women to go and visit another research university for a full year. You have time off to do research. In the 70s, I had, a little before this, I had started working with Manuel he had started working on pseudo randomness, cryptographically secure sequences, and we were looking at the X squared mod n pseudo random number generator, where n is a product of two primes of a special type. They're called Blum primes. So I had told this to Steve Smale, whom I knew, and he told me that the student Mike Schub had, for his thesis, had looked at squaring on the circle with multiplying 2x on the unit interval between 0 and 1. You take a number between 0 and 1, multiply it by 2, you get something, you get these orbits. 2 times that, do it mod 1. You get these orbits in the unit interval. So that's squaring on the circle. It's mod 2, and it's sort of related to what's called the Bernoulli sequences. So the squaring on the circle, and we were doing squaring. He said, well, why don't you get in touch with Mike? Maybe there's something related to that. And so Manuel and I visited Mike, and it turns out that if you look at the discrete version of the squaring on the circle, the Bernoulli shift, it turns out to have lots and lots of nice cryptographic properties. It's very spread around, these orbits spread around. Given a point, you might ask, when could you get to that point? Well, that's hard because of discrete log. There were just so many distribution things that made it look like a good random number generator, except we showed that if you give a little snippet of these sequences of a certain length, and they're small, the length of twice the length of the generator, essentially plus 1, you could actually generate the sequence forwards and backwards very quickly using continued fractions. So we showed that.
Sorry, just want to add something here. So I think here we are talking about the pseudo-random number. I mean, so as if you are, just give some background. So when you can use the rand or other functions and generate some numbers. But the issue is that this number that we are doing is almost random, or not quite random. This is the whole idea that, how can we, but they are good enough for lots of applications. That's the whole idea. And I think this is the concept of pseudo-random number. That's the thing that we care about it. And the issue is that how many random bits we really need to have to can generate, this bigger random pseudo-randoms. So yeah, if you want to give a little bit more, ideas about it for the people who are not familiar, I think that would be great.
Right. So you can think of them as randomness amplifiers or generators. You start with a small random bit. We were working on that. So it turned out that we got a little more information about the discrete version of X squaring on the circle, and we showed, well, it had a lot of nice properties. Actually, it was completely predictable. And we showed these other properties of X squared mod n, which had very nice properties. But okay, so we started working with Mike on that, and then went back to Berkeley, and Mike calls me up one day, and he says, Lenore, I just got this really interesting announcement from the National Science Foundation. They have a special fellowship for somebody exactly like you, someone who's teaching at a small liberal arts college, doesn't have that much time to do research, and can be off for a year doing research. Why don't you apply and come and work with me? So what was interesting is that's the program that I actually initiated and never thought that I would be a beneficiary of, actually. I mean, that was really, I mean, that's sort of like, oh, wow.
And where was Mike at that time?
He was in New York at the Graduate Center of City University of New York, and he was also at IBM Research Center. Yeah, so he was in New York. And so I did apply, and I did get it. It was actually, it was very competitive. You know why? You know, if you get an NSF grant, well, it's usually 2 months, usually, and they'll pay you 2 months salary, right?
Yes.
And they'll pay overhead on the 2 months salary to university, which may be 100%. So if you're getting, I don't know, $25,000 for the 2 months or $20,000 for the 2 months, they'll give the university $20,000, right?
Yes.
But since these grants to women were for a whole year's salary, 12 months, they were getting overhead for 12 months salary. So the universities immediately realized they were good things to get. And so they were competing to have people apply for it. So if you had a $100,000 salary, they would get $100,000 overhead. So they became very competitive. Money talks to get more women in, really. Yes. Money talks. So anyway, I got it and I split it for 2 years, half a year, because Avrim was still in high school then. And so Avrim was with Manuel and back in Berkeley, and I would go and visit Mike in New York. And that's when we started doing some really interesting work on, he was working with Steve Smale on algorithms over the real numbers. And we were interested in these rational maps, rational functions, like we have a polynomial with number of variables p over a polynomial q of a number of variables. And in a real number model, those can be evaluated pretty quickly, okay? But we wanted to know, people were sort of starting to say real number models are not that realistic, and we were thinking that they really were realistic, actually, for proving theorems and making assumptions. And what we showed is that evaluating rational functions, we say infinite precision is finite cost and tractable on average. So we said that the amount of the loss of precision in computing P over Q, any number of variables, any degrees, would be, when you're computing it, the loss of precision would be small on average and actually a function of just the key parameters, the number of variables, degrees, and something like that. So we started to show that it might make sense to really assume that you can compute P over Q using the real number model.
Yeah. So I think, again, sorry, to give some background here is like, I mean, when we work with the computer, generally, I mean, we don't have like a real number precision. We are cutting the numbers by, like, I don't know, like a few bytes, for example, we have it maybe 8 bytes or something, but at the end it will be cut. And here the question is that, I mean, the precision that we have it with real numbers, it might be different than when you also sum a few numbers or do the operation, this error actually just sums up. So that's like, in some sense, if we have it with real numbers, I assume there is not much of error.
You don't have to add, you don't have to have a huge number of bits on average to get the right answer to a certain accuracy. So think about computing like 1 over x. 1 over x, when x is less than 1, you have to keep a lot of bits. 1 over x, when x is very large, you don't have to keep a lot of bits. So we were wanting to know how many bits do you have to keep on average. So if you think about, so 1 over x is 1 over x is the polynomial on the bottom, right?
Yeah, and so essentially you will say that if 1 over x, if x is small, then it is important to have, I mean, keep lots of bits, but if it becomes large, then there is no need to do that because the value would be almost zero, and then they show what is the average number that we can keep X such that we have.
So the average number is about 2. And the way we had to prove this actually was very interesting, because we had to show that the volume of points with a denominator that was close to 0, we had to compute the volume of that, actually. We had to show where the bottom would be, the denominator would be 0. And if you're close to 0, you're going to have to use a lot of bits. So we needed to compute the volume of the tube around where it was 0, and to compute that volume, because that would tell you very much where it would be very bad. And if that volume wasn't so bad, then the number of the loss of condition wasn't so bad. So it turned into a geometric problem of computing volumes of tubes, which became something that Mike and Steve used a lot. But we had just done it for this particular problem. So that's got me working with Mike, who's working with Steve Smale, who got me working together. And that's when we started doing the real number model, where we were making the assumptions that you're like a mathematician. It's sort of like in high school when you learned how do you take, if you have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, and you want to find the zeros. But your teacher never says, suppose that those are integers or rational numbers or finite precision numbers. They're just saying they're real numbers. Okay, so we're acting like your high school teacher would act when they're talking about looking at zeros of polynomial quadratic equations or something. So that's how we took the model, and that's how a lot of numerical analysts took the model but of course it has to be qualified. So we actually looked, and that was the first paper we wrote on theory of computation, complexity of real numbers. We showed that in this model, you would have, we were looking at computing over a ring or a field. So we were really interested in the reals or complex numbers, but the field could be Z2. So we got universal NP-complete problems. That was just take a system of polynomial equations of any degree, finite system, and you're asking whether or not that system has a solution over the field you start with. And if you think about it over Z2, that's just the polynomial. That actually comes down to the SAT. It's exactly SAT. And then we have 4 fees in general for reals, it's like 3 SAT. So we were getting these analogs to the Z2 classical case. And we were getting analogs that, in fact, what we call the Hilbert-Null-Stahlen-Satz, which was, given any finite system of equations, whether or not it has a solution, we call that Hilbert-Null-Stahlen-Satz. We showed, like, over the reals or complex numbers, that's exponential, exactly like it is over Z2, but whether or not it's polynomial, not known, and lots of people are working on that. It's the same way, looking how to find solutions to this, how to tell. That's a key problem. Yes.
Let me ask you a question. So, are there some other important problems in this field that is still unknown and the people are working on that?
Well, I think the problem that relates the two theories, yeah. So, for example, is linear programming strongly polynomial?
Yes, okay. So that is like somehow continuation.
In our model, and is it polynomial? Is there an algorithm? So, in fact, that's what got me interested in the condition number a lot. So let's see if I can. I actually looked at condition a lot, and in fact, in 1989, in the paper I wrote, lectures I gave, I was the first person, along with Steve Smale, actually, at the same time, talked about how you get, you see, an intrinsic input word size. What was a natural input word size for problems that were naturally stated over the real numbers? And I wrote a paper that was in the notices, computing over the reals where Turing meets Newton. Actually, this was based on my another talk at the AMS. And as my punchline, I had the condition number. But nobody got to the punchline. And then very soon after, Cook and somebody else wrote another, putting me down and saying we have to go back to the discrete. So I wrote another paper, which I gave actually at the Turing Centennial, where I put the punchline up front. Alan Turing is well known in discrete complexity
Yes.
for the 1936 paper, right? Where he divides. But numerical analysis, no, Alan Turing, for his 1948 paper, he's looking at linear systems. And he says a number of methods for solving sets of linear equations and inverting matrices are discussed. The theory of the round-off errors involved is investigated for some of these methods. So he's looking at the loss of precision. In all cases examined, including the well-known Gaussian elimination process, it is found that the errors are normally, and normally here he means on average, quite moderate. No exponential build-up need occur. So what he's suggesting is when you're looking at things like Gaussian elimination, even though they may in the worst case have losing a lot of precision, actually, normally on average, they don't. And that's what he's suggesting. And so he's looking at this thing of linear systems, and then he wants to know how to measure condition. And he actually gives something that's very close to what numerical analysts give as the condition number in this paper. And it's called the spectral condition number, but it's the norm of A. The norm of A inverse is what he gives in this paper.
So that's the part that you mentioned. Turing essentially meets Newton.
It has the condition number for these problems. The condition number for many of these problems is just the derivative, the norm of the derivative. That's Newton. And that was my punchline. So I put that way up in front in this new paper to talk about the condition, how Turing has the condition, how the condition is really the norm of the derivative, how we use it here, how his model, is really talks about real number model and all of that. So in this newer paper that I did for the Turing Centennial, where of course I met Turing's nephew, whose last name is Turing, so I have a lot of emails from Turing.
I see.
But anyway, this was what I meant where Turing meets Newton. Turing's 48 paper really has the essence of the real number model and the condition number and how important it is when you analyze algorithms for problems like linear systems over the reals. And in fact, later on, actually, Mike Shub and I, from our paper, we gave that the average loss of condition for linear systems was polynomial, but actually, Edelman at MIT, in his PhD thesis, gave the best, I think it's logarithm. It's the log. And it's exactly what Edelman gave on average was exactly what Turing was looking for using these sophisticated techniques. Oh yeah, so those are the 2 years we spent in Hong Kong, very interesting, to 96 to 98, where we wrote our book. That's the book with Philippa Cooper came on board. It was like the definitive things up to, let's say, 2000.
So when was this book?
It came out in 1999, 2000.
Okay. And I think the book of Avrim that came out officially.
I don't know that his book came out. Yeah, I put it on my website. When we were in Hong Kong, we got an email from Jim Morris, and he said, maybe you're think of come back to Carnegie Mellon. He always asked us, and we said, we're in Hong Kong. And we said, well, Berkeley, been there, done that. Hong Kong was really fun. I didn't think about Berkeley very much. My grandkids are in Pittsburgh. Avrim's in Pittsburgh. Let's go to Pittsburgh. So here we go, back to Pittsburgh. All of us there. So it was kind of unique. 3 of us professors. It was very unique. 3 of us professors in the same university, same school, same department, same group.
Yeah, but I will say, in that sense, actually, MIT also, I of course, lots of people know about the Carnegie Mellon, the connection to Carnegie Mellon, but the same has been also for MIT also, that like earlier life that has been like that, and then it turned to CMU in 2000. Yeah, so one other question actually is interesting here. So I think you have, played lots of efforts about this women's rights and other stuff, especially for science. So have you, and as I mentioned, for example, you were the leader for this ALADDIN project that was a few years NSF program that I was a postdoc there, and was a great thing.
Yeah. So we had the theory group at Carnegie Mellon, and Carnegie Mellon, as you know, was actually interested in the synergy between theory and practice. So the theory group in general was interested. Guy Blelick had been teaching a course, Algorithms in the Real World, and out of that became this proposal to NSF to form what was called an ITR Center, what was called ITR, Information Technology Research Center, which would have a synergy between theory and practice. And I became part of that proposal, and then I became a co-PI on it, and Guy and I became co-directors of this proposal. And what we were trying to do, we got at that time the largest, I think, grant that any theory, we estimated $5 million, something like that, that any theory group had gotten. And what that enabled us to do was really to support visitors, postdocs, to support some of our graduate students, and also to support a whole bunch of projects. See, you know, everybody on campus was reinventing the wheel of algorithms, and we were the algorithms experts, right? So what we were doing, we were connecting with people who were having optimal algorithms and this and that, and forming what we call probes for ALADDIN. ALADDIN also is algorithms, adaptation, dissemination, integration. All of this are code words. So we formed lots of projects that would have theory at its base, but would look at application areas. So the CAPTCHA project, which was one of them, as you know, turned into reCAPTCHA, turned into Duolingo. Gary's project on meshing for blood flow, his meshing algorithms that would look at fluid flow and where the fluid wasn't homogeneous, but you have blood which was non-homogeneous, and he was working with physicians who were trying to get a heart assist pump that wouldn't chop up the cells of the blood. So they had to have changing meshes that wouldn't affect the interior cells, So his fast algorithms, he was working with doctors on that. So that was one of the algorithms. Moore-Halkel-Balter was looking at, through her queuing theory algorithms, was looking at how you could minimize energy consumption in server farms, which they have all these servers and server farms and big warehouses that were on all the time and creating a lot of heat and a lot of fire or heat, and you had to turn them off and on, but you didn't want to turn them off because maybe you had to boot them up quickly and that would take time. So how do you do that in the most efficient manner? And so a lot of her algorithms were very good for looking at that. So we were looking at our group's algorithms or theory and see how they applied in the real world with other faculty on Carnegie Mellon campus. So we were really excited by this. We had many, many projects. We had many workshops and really great. Then I think we got this in 2001. I can't remember exactly the date.
Yeah, I think that was at that time. I think that was the start of it. Like 2007, I think that was the almost end of it. As far as I remember, that was for 5 years.
Yeah. So what happened was, I remember Guy and I went to, it was a meeting called for all the PIs and co-PIs of these projects across the country. NSF was funding many of them across the country. And we all came, I think this was more or less our poster for that conference. And everybody was doing really interesting projects. It was really neat to see all the different groups. And the guy who was the head of the project, the program at NSF, says he has an announcement to make. So he gets up at lunchtime and says, well, folks, you know, very exciting development. Okay, we're going to eliminate the program. The money is going back to individual grants. And I was thinking, what a waste. Here we've had all these programs that had so many good projects, funded so many people without all the overhead of every individual person having to write their own program and compete with each other. We were doing under one center. And that really upset me so much.
Yeah, actually, I mean, for me, it was, I mean, quite, I mean, different. So like when I was at MIT, they were like a very individual professor that they were work together. I was actually, I can say I'm proud that I could actually connect some of them. I think like Piotr Indyk and Eric had the paper together because of the problem that I was working with both of them. Or, for example, Tom Layton and Eric, we had a few papers actually together. But generally, it was individual people. When I came to MIT, that was to CMU, that was exactly the thing, that the people were working together a lot. I think that is ALADDIN was exactly one of the reasons for that, that everyone got the money, they were very friendly, and they were working together. That was a great thing. That unfortunately, as you mentioned, the money didn't continue.
Yeah, it was absolutely, I don't know how they, but, you know, it just struck me as a stupidity, really, because I'd seen how well, and also we were talking to other projects, you know, from across the country, and everybody seemed to be as excited as we were about what was happening in our thing. So what happened was I decided I had this great idea, which was totally naive, but I thought, well, okay, let's go the next step. Let's commercialize some of these ideas, and then we can bring money back to research. Okay, let's commercialize. Okay, I knew nothing about commercialization or about anything about that. But I gave a talk in Pittsburgh in 2005, and I called it Project Olympus. It was my code name. And so saying then students would stay around if they had a chance. And I said that we would have this project where we'd have a dynamic, highly visible high-tech center, sandbox to create innovative technology and train high-tech leaders, whatever. And I called it Project Olympus, whatever. And it was an outgrowth of, so it started in 2007, of our projects there. And many of, so you can see the recapture comes out of capture. And some of these came out of Salvi, came out of, but it turned out to be a huge thing because at that time, Pittsburgh was not a startup center at all.
Yes.
And I was trying to I thought what this would do would keep some of our students I thought for one thing, we could commercialize some of our research and bring money back to research. And so, you know, it takes a while for any project to become a unicorn. We have one already that's sort of a unicorn, but so it was kind of naive in that way. But I was kind of lucky because I started to do a shows and tells starting in 2007. I did 25 of these over the years. But there had never been a way for people in the Pittsburgh community to come onto the Carnegie Mellon campus and see what was going on. So I started these shows and tells to focused on some of the university research and focus on some of the startups that were coming out, and also on some of the students and some of the connections with people in the community. There you can see I was leading it, and there you can see Manuel, who was in machine learning, you know, AI.
She was working on robotics as well. And,
and there's Kamel Majidi, who was from the mechanical engineering, doing great stuff in soft mechanics, and Priya Narasimhan, and there's Elise Banan. And then we have one of our graduates who has started a huge center in Boston, come back to give some perspective. Anyway, we were doing that. And in fact, turned out to be hugely successful, still going on. And here's one of the latest things. So we have more than 1,000 projects and more than 250 startups and more than $750 million in startup funding and whatever. So it's been a pretty huge thing. Women SCS was pretty huge. Half our undergraduates were women when I left, so that was pretty huge. So that, and a lot of my story at Carnegie Mellon, you know, we sort of retired in 2019.
Both you and Manuel, or?
Yeah, we both left. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk about our project that we're so excited about.
Yeah, so I think we will talk about it, but just a few things actually, it was interesting. So 2 questions. I wanted to actually ask about the leadership, position that you took. And I think that was this ALADDIN and about leadership position. And and this, I think, ALADDIN and then this Olympus, these are like exactly the type of great things that you have done. Have you thought, like during your life, to go maybe more in terms of, I don't know, in the companies, take higher positions, or like, I don't know, go to chair, dean, and other things? That's one thing I think that's interesting. That have you thought about?
Actually, So what's interesting is I never saw myself in that role. I always saw myself as a research mathematician, but then I was so surprised myself that I was good at it. And I had this innate talent, which I didn't know where it came from. Because again, with Olympus, I knew nothing but quickly. So I knew nothing about women math, but after that one event, I quickly became the center of things. And actually here with the show and tell, I did the same thing. The first show and tell I had in 2007, everybody in Pittsburgh who was in the business community got to know me. And all of a sudden, I got part of that community, and then sort of saw quickly what I saw the difference between business and research. I saw what people valued in one thing, they didn't value in the other, and that how they each couldn't talk. They could talk past each other rather than have some common thing. Yeah, so I really quite quickly saw those things, and I think I helped be a bridge person. But I only like doing these things when I look back. Is things I started myself because there was a need.
Yeah, another one I mean that thing that is was very exciting to me about. I mean, we were talking about pure math and not even applied math, and then we talk about these startups and lot of this. And I think the change was amazing. That you could change the whole thing and lead this thing. That was I think because I think ALADDIN was still more like more theory things. But I think this Olympus was completely, I think, different. Just having a new horizon essentially to practical things and startups. That was actually great things because I didn't think left after ALADDIN, but it's actually great things. And how did you? Thinking. I think you mentioned that you just came to this position and see that you're good at it and you could do that. But any more insight for others who want to do it, something like it, from pure theory to pure practice?
I think a role I played, I don't think there are many people who are playing that role, and unfortunately enough. So what I noticed is in the business world, good enough is good enough. But in the research world, certainly good enough is not good enough. Okay. But researchers have to learn that maybe at some point you have to start and do something new. You have to move on. Right. And maybe that's something you can learn from the business world that pivots, changes. On the other hand, the business world has to know that they better really understand what they're doing. So right now, and particularly a lot of the projects that came out of Olympus, everybody is saying they're using machine learning, AI, and the new companies, everybody's saying they're using deep learning, whatever. And they don't know what they're talking about. And
exactly.
So they've got to learn from the researchers that they really have to have people on board who understand what's going on and really what they're doing. So they're not fooling themselves or other people. So I think that we can, there is, and I don't know if there are people around who want to look and see that there are advantages from a point of view of pivoting and moving on. But there are certain advantages of going deeply, and you have to have that too. And so I think with all of these things, again, with the women's movement thing, when I started doing things with expanding the horizons and the Math Science Network, a lot of women coming out of the women's movement were saying, oh, we have to just let people learn about math anxiety and see why they became anxious with mathematics and maybe do psychology groups or whatever. And I was saying, no, the way you get rid of math anxiety is to learn how to do mathematics. You just have to teach better and really cut the crap. Like a lot of the remedial courses that we were giving women were stuff they never needed to use. Why don't you, if you haven't had enough high school mathematics, go directly into calculus. You'll learn the stuff you need, and then you'll have some power to do more. So because I knew you didn't need the stuff, I was able to jump over. So there was nobody in the women's movement at the time who was saying, hey, you could get right into calculus even if you didn't have the 4 years of high school math. You could do it if you just have to be taught properly, and you could do it, and then you can go into engineering if you want, or some statistics, or whatever, in economics, the higher levels. So I knew that you could do what other people did. So I had that kind of duality of taking the feminist sensibility, but also knowing that they were doing it in a way that wasn't going to be helpful. just getting rid of your math anxiety, that you remember that your fifth grade teacher put you down wasn't going to help you do calculus. Just because you were able to tell people, oh, I felt so bad when my teacher put me down. No, that's not going to help you. What will help you is that you really feel comfortable doing some calculus, maybe, or something else, you know.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, like my understanding is that, I mean, if you want to even do like, I mean, like women or not, if you want to do more practical stuff, also, I mean, you should not be afraid to deep dive into more math stuff first, because there, I mean, these are the concepts that later, I mean, maybe form or train your brain better. Then you can also do that stuff, and you should not somehow distinguish this from each other. These are like somehow one after the other. I think that was exactly the evidence was the one that you mentioned in this thing, that I mean, from pure math we went all the way to practical stuff.
Yeah, but I think that you lose something. So if I had stayed in the area that I had started with my thesis, for example, I would have been able to evolve that with other colleagues. And then I think that would have evolved into more computational things and more complexity of bringing this logic more, you know, so it would have been a different thread that I would have taken into newer and newer areas along that line, when I was very interested that I could prove that an algorithm existed just theoretically, and I could prove it existed a solution to this differential equation theoretically. I would have then been able to have more insight into how maybe to do it practically.
Yeah, I think the key is the one that you mentioned. I think the business one. So maybe at our research we can dive deep, but at some point we should also think about it. Maybe what is enough. So that's the way that you can maybe say, okay, that's one field I have done it. Maybe improved it. Maybe I should go to other things. Maybe I can, I mean, get this one and turn it into a company. I think this thing that, I mean, good is not enough. Maybe sometimes is somehow is barrier. If you have, I mean, go deep dive, but maybe at some point also say maybe good thing is enough. Can I do something after? One quick question before going there. I think that also would be important. I mean, especially because we talk about your own family, your mother. Actually, you said, okay, I don't want to go to the school, and say, okay, that's fine. Let's have a fun, essentially. And so, how about the relation with you and Avrim, especially? Because I think you were both mathematicians. So, like, what was your approach? Did you plan that he become mathematician, or did you? I mean, you took the approach that is more liberal, like your mom.
Yeah, I think several things. First of all, he was only child. And so, you know, we always work at the kitchen table. So he's there with us all the time. So he's listening to all this stuff, and he's a good student also. So he's gravitating to a lot of things that particularly Manuel is talking about. And Manuel once asked him, how did you decide to go into math computer science? And Avrim said, well, you once gave me the questions you were going to give to your PhD students for their final exam or for their qualifying exam or something, and I could answer all of them. So I think I felt I could do it. So that's what, you know, yeah, as I said, he had a kind of advantage culturally for that. You know, he's already a good student, but he had advantage culturally. And I think also my being away at, you know, it was 2.5 years when I was in New York, when he was in high school. I never asked him, but I think I would have been more of a helicopter mom. At least for the years he was applying at college. I think I might have been very, you know, overpowering. And by not being there so much, I think that was good for him. But I don't know. I've never asked him that question. How was it for you, Av, when I was away those months? I haven't, you know, maybe I'm afraid of the answer. I don't know. But he was with Manuel, so he had a good person to be with.
Yeah, I think now let's go to the most interesting part, maybe one of the most interesting part about the consciousness. I think before that, let me just mention something that I learned from Manuel, actually. That was another interesting thing, I think I want to say, memory that when I was a postdoc at CMU, like, it was quite actually interesting that Manuel came and knocked my door and said, okay, let's go for lunch. And that was actually amazing. I was very amazed to go with Manuel and, I mean, talk with him. And this consciousness actually is one of the things that he mentioned to me, like a few of lunches. And actually I worked with him about, I mean, some of these recapture ideas as well. But one interesting thing that he mentioned, and I mentioned this one, I don't know to how many students later, but this idea of consciousness, I think you can then add more to that, just some maybe introduction to that. He was mentioned this, we should understand this consciousness. It's very important. Why? Because, I mean, if we, so if we understand it, then the computers can do the work that humans can't do that. And if we cannot understand it, then we can distinguish computers from bots and other things. And this idea, it is some kind of win-win. If we understand it better, we get more things we can do more. If we cannot, if we don't, like we can distinguish them, again, it is good because then we can distinguish computers versus humans. I think just that, like, very important, and all the time I had this one in my mind. Even nowadays, lots of things that I was thinking it was yeah. Anyhow, this is, I think, just the introduction. I think you may want to go and talk more about this.
Yeah. I also want to comment. So you heard about consciousness from him, but you also saw that he went and knocked on your door. And one of the things Avrim told me about you, and I asked him, he said you were a great advisor. You have to your students. So maybe that's something you also sort of picked up.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that always I had Avrim. I mean, because we sit with Avrim. I mean, of course, I had the pleasure to go with Manuel about lunch and talk about it. But with Avrim, I mean, actually, we actually sit for a long time. And I mean, working with students, I think that was a great way that I like, again, it was maybe not, yeah, it was a bit different at MIT, I will say. But yeah, so surely I think that had a big effect in my life, essentially, about working with students. And thanks for saying that, yeah.
So I should tell you that consciousness, the scientific study of consciousness, has been taboo for until about 30 years ago. And in fact, when Manuel was working in Warren's lab, he asked Warren, he told Warren he wanted to work on consciousness, and Warren said, no, in certain terms, no, you will not work on consciousness. And Walter Pitts said that to Manuel too, you are not going to work on consciousness. So consciousness was the study of theologians over the millennia and philosophers, right? Philosophers and theologians. And it's only since the past 30 years that consciousness has been a study of, from the point of view of many others. So there continues to be a lot of philosophers, but it's become an area of study of neuroscientists, okay, and psychologists and cognitive psychologists. So we're coming from a different point of view from theoretical computer science. So that's sort of the way we're looking at consciousness. We're not looking at it as neuroscientists, but we're, I think we do have concede that maybe some of our ideas may make sense. The conscious Turing machine is influenced very much by Alan Turing's simple yet powerful model of computation. So, like Minsky's 23 or 28 state universal Turing machine can do whatever you can do, whatever you can compute. In the cloud, it can compute whatever you can do. On a supercomputer, you can compute in that. But you can get your head of, and that's been the sort of the basis of theoretical computer science. You have a nice model, you can prove theorems about it, and so forth. And so that's one of the things that are inspiring us, is that we want to get some kind of a very, very simple model that will at least help for us explain things about consciousness. Okay, so that's been a motivating force. But the other influence is the work of Bernard Bars and the global workspace theory of consciousness. And so this is work that was done in 85 or 88, I think. And it really made a big difference in terms of putting consciousness on that it might be an okay thing to study, because he's a cognitive neuroscientist. And he wrote this book about the theater model. And so let me tell you what the theater model is. The theater model is, you have a stage which has an actor on it, and that stage is that actor is communicating to a huge audience of unconscious processes. The actor on stage is reading a script, and maybe that gets broadcast to the unconscious processes, who then immediately become conscious of what the actor's saying. And some of the audience members want to get information on stage, and they talk to each other and they get information on stage. So let me give you an example that it may have happened to you. You know, you go to a party and you see somebody that you know, but for the life of you, you can't remember that person's name, your name, right? And then you go home and an hour, half hour later, her name pops up into your consciousness. Does it ever happen to you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot actually.
Never happens to me, but happens to a lot of our students. Okay, happens
Yeah.
to. So what's going on? So what's going on there is that the message, what's her name? You're asking yourself, what's her name? That's coming from your unconscious processors, and that message is coming up on stage. You're asking, what's her name? I really want to know, getting up on the consciousness. And that gets broadcast down to all your unconscious processors, who are then trying to make use of, answer that question. And one processor then decides that, oh, remembers where you met her. For example, she was in one of your computer science classes, and that gets up to consciousness and that gets broadcast down. And another processor remembers that, well, she was interested in AI. That was an AI class. And then another processor remembers her name starts with T, and then you remember her name is Tanya. Okay, so this thing of your unconscious process, and you really don't have a sense of where that's coming from. After a while, it pops up, Tanya is her name, and you have no clue. But every so often, you may have remembered T, the name, the computer science class, the AI course, whatever. Those few things get up there. Okay. So what's going on? You don't know. So this is the model that we're looking at, very much like that. Okay, that's called the theater model. So let me give you the theater model. Okay, back up a little bit. But before I give you the model, I want to say a couple of words about the model. So this model is like Turing's model is not a model of a supercomputer, right? The CTM is not a model of the brain. And so it considers the brain at a very high level of abstraction at levels well above that of neurons and neuronal activity. We have to stress this because we're not going to tell you, we're not going to tell neuroscientists the short-term memory is happening in your, prefrontal cortex or wherever. We're not going to tell you where these things are happening. We're not going to give you the neuroscience information from our model. Whereas like the simple Turing machine isn't going to tell you where in the supercomputer these functions are happening. Okay. And also for you guys in computer science, the CTM is not a standard Turing machine. And what gives the CTM the feeling of consciousness is not its input-output map. So we're very used to, in computer science and theoretical computer science, is looking at machines being equivalent if they have the same input-output map, right? And they're also working in these algorithmic ways. We might put a condition on some time to compare them, but we don't put too much condition on the input-output map. That's really the model we have. Okay, so for the CTM, that's not the case. If we unwind the CTM to get an equivalent model, it's not going to have the feeling of consciousness. We're saying that its feeling of consciousness comes from what's under the hood, several features of inside its structure. And one is the global workspace architecture, which I'll tell you what it is in a minute. Plus something that we call predictive dynamics, cycles of in prediction, feedback. So predictions, feedback, and learning in many places in the CTM. And some very special key processes, inner speech processor, model of world processor, and processors that commute in what we call rich multimodal inner language. And so it's a language not like English, but it's a language that combines words and sounds and feelings. Their little element of gist might combine, the smell of something, the word for it, the sound for it, the look of it, the onion, the way it looks, the way it feels, the way you write onion, all those kinds of things. And we call that brainish. Okay. So if you unwind all this and you don't have those properties, we're not all guarantees are off. So people have asked us, if you simulate the CTM in the universal Turing machine, won't the universal Turing machine be conscious? And we're saying, no, you've really destroyed a lot of the property, and you've destroyed some of the complexity, the time things that we have built into this machine as well when you're unwinding some of the parallel processing that's going on. Okay, so let me give you a little idea. I have this picture up here. This is from a poster I had made. And so formally, the conscious Turing machine is a 7-tuple. I don't know if you can see my 7-tuple part here. Okay. It consists of what we call the short-term memory, the long-term memory, the up tree, down tree, links, input, output. And then we have to formally define each of these 7 things, which I'm not going to formally do. But what I'm going to do is give you the picture like Turing's picture of a Turing machine with a tape, and I'll tell you what all these pieces are. So we have this short-term memory. That's like Bars' stage, and that it's a read-write memory, and it's small, and it can hold one chunk of information. And we formally define chunk, and I'm not going to tell you what the chunk is, but it in turn is like a 6-tuple. It has a gist of information, and it has some weight, a valence weight attached to it, which tells you how important the processor thinks that chunk is, that information is. So it has some parameters like that. Okay, let's go down here. So that's it. And then we have many long-term memory processors. That's the LTM. So this is the STM, this is the LTM, and we think we have a lot of them, like 10 to the 7. Some of those are built into the machine, and some of them are just attached to things in the real world that are. We're making use of all the technology that's out there also. So you can see there's Google out there, and there's some other things. I don't know what other things I have. I have Siri there. Yeah, a few things. Okay, so, and these are parallel processors. They're powerful, and originally they're not connected at all. So that's the original model of that. Okay, so we have also, I have to tell you the up tree. So I've told you short-term memory, long-term memory, up tree. Okay, so at every moment in time, processors put chunks of information that they want to get into short-term memory or onto stage. And so that one of those chunks might have the gist in it that says, what's her name? And it's very important to get, you really want to get it. So you give a very, very high positive weight to that. And you may give it so much weight that it goes through a competition here. These chunks go through competitions. Some went out and then they move up, and then the ones that went out here, they go up, and some others went out until one gets up here. And it's pretty fast up tree competition. We give a very, very precise competition of how this goes up. And it's actually a probabilistic competition for many reasons. At each of these nodes in the up tree, we have a point toss algorithm, which will compute certain probabilities, and the chunk will go up depending on those probabilities, which will depend initially on various variables, and variables that it's changing as these chunks are moving up. Okay, so there's a little coin flip algorithm in each of these things. But eventually, and not too long, a chunk will get up pretty quickly. And as soon as it gets up in here, it's immediately broadcast to all the long-term memory processors through the down tree immediately. So in one step goes way down. So that's sort of the process. And we say that the conscious Turing machine becomes consciously aware as soon as it receives the chunk that was in short-term memory. That's the conscious content. As soon as it gets it, it puts it in. And every moment of time, it keeps on putting chunks in. So once he gets that, another processor should say, well, she was in a computer science class, et cetera, different processes. And processors don't all have to put chunks in, but they might put null chunks in, whatever. Okay, and so this process is happening from time to time. When one processor finds out that another processor has a kindred spirit, like one processor asked, what's her name? And the other one said, yes, her name was Tina. So that answer name, links will form between those processors. Okay, so there were no links originally, and links will form when processors start to realize another processor. And they're actually, from the chunks have the addresses of the processors. They know which processors gave that information. So what's happening is, from time to time, there are more and more links forming. And as I said, there's this common language brainish, and exchanging messages in brainish. A lot of information that's going from one processor to another processor that usually the first went through short-term memory through consciousness becomes unconscious. So when you're first learning to ride a bike, a lot of things are happening through consciousness. But after a while, a lot of these connections will form and it becomes unconscious. Conscious processing becomes unconscious with links forming. So that's the link part of the thing happening. Then we have inputs that are coming in from the external world through sensors that go directly to long-term memory processors. And from time to time, one processor might shout out, her name is Tina, and then we'll talk and say that. And we have it going directly from the long-term memory processors. So that's where the activity is going, from these long-term memory processors up to sending information up to here, being broadcast down, getting information from the outside world, getting information from here, showing the information up. And this stage is just being a holder for that conscious content. Okay, but what's happening within these processors? Okay, this is where we're collaborating with Avrim. Okay, so Avrim has these algorithms, these machine learning algorithms that are called sleeping experts algorithms. And what these sleeping experts algorithms do, so suppose some algorithm said her name starts with S, but it really ended up that her name was Tina. But S came in meantime into consciousness, so that processor put a heavy weight onto S. It was too egotistical. It wasn't right. It was too egotistical. So its sleeping expert algorithm will lower the weights it gives processors, it gives chunks in the future. It will moderate the weight. So that's that learning algorithm based on the feedback it's getting from the broadcasting or from the outside world. Maybe it's getting some input from the outside world. That sleeping experts, because you might think of these long-term memory processes as sleeping experts, that sleeping expert algorithm will change the weight. It'd say, oh, you're too aggressive, you're too egotistical, let's lower your weights for a little while. On the other hand, maybe one processor actually had her right name is Tina, but did not give enough weight to that just in its trunk. And it finds out her name really was Tina. So it's sleeping expert algorithm will say, hey, you better raise the weights that you're giving your chunks the next time around. So this is happening all the time where the processors are learning from feedback and then they're making adjustments all the time. There are adjustments happening. So because of this, there are adjustments happening because of other algorithms in these processors that are doing a lot of this prediction, learning, feedback and learning. But we have specially built in is this sleeping experts algorithm. Okay, so more or less, so we have the global workspace architecture, competition to get up, broadcast to come down. The competition we have is very, very nice because this probabilistic competition has the property. You might say, well, suppose because it's a binary tree, suppose I mix up some of these processors and put the heavy-weighted things together and lightweight things over, and maybe those would, the heavyweights might bias things or whatever. It turns out that with this probabilistic uptree that we have, it's independent. The probability of a chunk winning is totally independent of the location of the processor. It just has to do with some initial conditions that the processor put in its chunk. So totally independent of the probability of its winning. So which is nice property, which doesn't happen if we don't have that little probabilistic thing in our uptree nodes there.
Yeah, so let me add a few things here. I think that is actually just So the first thing, it would be interesting, I think, that you mentioned you're working with Avrim. It would be good to have a paper Blum. I don't think that I have seen two families like I have seen Vazirani papers. I have actually with my brother as well. But I think Blums would be nice. I think you don't have it yet, correct? A Blum paper.
Well, what our plan is, which we're trying to work on our spare time because we've been getting lots of talks and things, but we're working on a monograph, and in the monograph we'll have Avrim when he'll put this in. I think he's a little tenuous, Mom and Dad, what are you doing? What are you working on? But do you ever think of what Manuel's working on, at least? It always seems a little far out, right? Like, flipping a coin over a telephone, seems impossible, and things happen. So take it's going to work, and we're having fun. And Avram, I think he's getting a little bit sure of it. But he's planned to be on the manuscript in our monograph, right?
So does he have any paper with you or Manuel?
Pardon? Does he have a paper? I don't know if he does. Maybe. I don't know. Manuel and I think he may.
Yeah, but I think that was it was interesting actually to know that. So that was the first question. So the first comment. The second thing, actually, this model, I think you might familiar with the map-reduce model. That's the way that essentially, because this is some kind of distributed model, and this kind of map-reduce model that has been used. I mean, I don't know, it has been introduced maybe the past 10 years, but maybe more active now, about a Spark and other things. Lots of practical things actually using this map-reduced model. It is called massive parallel computation model.
Yeah,
and it had, go on.
Yeah, so we haven't tried, so we personally haven't tried to implement. We have one person who's actually trying to implement it, and that would be a really good suggestion of looking at some things like that. I would go back and say that this global workspace model actually was influenced by Alan Newell at Carnegie Mellon, who was using this model for cognitive learning, actually. So it actually has roots way back at Carnegie Mellon even, which I found interesting. So, these things are, what we have is a lot of these different features. But actually, so we're not implementing, we do have somebody who's looking at there's a group at IBM that's trying to implement. And also there's a student at Carnegie Mellon, Paul Yang, who's in machine learning, and part of his PhD thesis is developing brainish. So he does multimodal machine learning, so learning from different modalities, and he's showing how the conscious Turing machine can learn these different modalities, fuse them, and develop a brainish kind of.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think this MapReduce, I think I will mention that the original one is actually quite, technical, but the latest one that, we had actually some contribution and simplifying as well. So the latest model is much simpler. This is like essentially a set of processors that they have similarities with this one. It's not exactly like that, but they have, each of these processors have some limited space, and then they can, in each round, they can communicate with each other. They can talk this information to each other. And the catch is that you want to have the minimum number of rounds such that you will compute some things like the size of the matching in a graph or any other parameter.
You give me some reference, maybe you can send me some.
Yeah, I can send you that thing. So that would be good, because I think, the models generally, better. The people introduced the same was MapReduce. It was very technical. The people didn't believe that much of, ideas there. But I think it becomes actually very clean model that now the people consider it. It has a relation with PRAM. In some places it's close. Some places actually it's different. But the one thing it is important about MapReduce is that you consider the cases that you can have a constant number of rounds. You can do that. That in some sense might be much similar to brain, that this information, the one that you mentioned, go up and down, that's it, try to minimize these things. So that might be a good thing to look at it. And I think, and also to connect them, I think that would be very nice. It has several similarities, that each of these processors have a small memory. They cannot have the whole information in it, etc. So that would be a great thing to take a look at.
Good. So in fact, that's right. So one of the reasons for this, suppose a processor needs some information which it doesn't have, it will put it into this competition, and then since it's broadcast, another processor may have some information, will be able to help it out. So in fact, that is a one. So another reason to have this small memory up there is that you want to pay attention to one thing. If you pay attention to too many things at once, you sort of get confused. But this is happening all the time, so you're getting a lot of things, but you're paying attention to one thing at a time.
Yeah. So they have actually this one. It is called adaptive AMPC that has exactly this kind of shared memory in some sense that also the people can write it down adaptively. I think that's a nice thing. It would be connecting that would be very nice because especially that one it really works. Like lots of these results, this YouTube and sure that lots of places we are using this technology currently. So this Spark or MapReduce and others, that would be great to, connect with that. It's not exactly like, but has similarities. And one other question, do you want to add something? Yeah.
Yeah, so I would like to hear your questions. I want to say I'm not finished yet because very important are some special processes. So one is like we'll call inner speech or inner generalized speech. You know, you talk to yourself. Very important. Do you talk to yourself?
So there you compute it. So each of these computers, these are like computers. They can, on the data that they have, they compute. Now the question is that whether they have exponential time compute or polynomial time compute. We don't know that much the difference between these two so far, because it seems that the information that you have it essentially somehow restrict you for that. But that in some sense, that's the computation that they are doing, each of them. They have some kind of limited computation that they can do.
But my question to you, Mohammed, is: do you talk to yourself?
Yeah, sure. Sure.
Okay, so that's one of our. Let me get this. That's one of our very, 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 very important processes in the speech processor, and more generally, there's dogs talking doggish or whatever. So they're different languages, but that's one. Having an inner speech is very, very important. And another one, there are a lot of important ones, and another one is the model of the world, that we make an internal model of the world. We make models of our world, both internal and external, and we label them, and we make predictions in these models. And that's one of our predictions, is that, our feeling that we're conscious comes very much from these models of these worlds that we're making. Let me just tell you one other thing. So a lot of people have asked us, well, isn't that just recursion if you have this CTM and it has this model of itself and it has model of itself? No, these models of the world are somehow caricatures. So when you go down a recursion or two, they're just not too much information, but they are caricatures with snippets, gists of information that from those gists, you can generate a whole lot more of information. Very, very important. And this is if people know some of the neuroscientists' views on consciousness, Michael Graziano's, our explanation for the feeling of consciousness in a conscious Turing machine is very similar to Michael Graziano's, and it depends a lot on the model of the world processors. So I'm just saying that there's some very important processors. One other thing that we do is to show we've looked at some phenomena that neuroscientists or cognitive neuroscientists have identified as phenomena that's related to consciousness. And we've shown how a number of that phenomena our conscious Turing machine can experience. So there's one that's called blind sight. It's a person who is in a crowded room. Someone asks them to go across the room in the door, and they say, I can't see, how can I do it? And then they get up and they walk and they maneuver across the room. So they actually can have some sense of sight. They can maneuver fine, but they don't believe it. Blind sight. We show how very simply our CTM can have blind sight. There's something called inattentional blindness, something called change blindness. We show how a number of these things our CTM can experience. So we've been going through a whole list of, somebody has just asked me about masking, which is another phenomenon. So we're actually looking at a whole bunch of these and showing how the CTM, this very simple model, would be able to experience at a high level very much the similar phenomena. So our explanations are very, very high level, we're saying, well, because the gists have to be small and they have to explain things in a certain amount of time, and when you're playing chess, you have feeling, you have free will to do everything, but you have to in a certain amount of time to do it, and so you have the feeling of free will, even though you don't have all the time in the world, right? So we're using those, the complexity arguments and the size of our gist arguments and the way this is constructed to show that the CTM will have the feeling of free will, will have the feeling it's conscious, will exhibit that we can have a blind sight CTM, we can have a CTM that doesn't see the gorilla amidst the people there. You see the gorilla in there? I don't know if you see the gorilla. Yeah. And that, so we can show why our CTM will behave a lot like humans behave in certain situations.
So one question for the audience. Is there, a paper? I think
I would say the better paper to read is an archive, because we had to cut a lot down in the proceedings paper. We had to cut a lot down, cut a lot of pictures out, cut a lot of things out. And also we have there 28, and we're going to add to it. Many people ask us questions. For example, the question I sort of asked at the beginning, if you simulate the conscious Turing machine on a Turing machine, wouldn't it feel conscious too? No. So we have 28 questions, frequently asked questions, and we try to give answers to that in the archive paper.
That was another thing that I was thinking, like I mentioned recently, that, you may think about, I think like maybe 100 years from now, they might be able to actually scan the whole brain of mine and put it on some robots. And that robot can even, I may die, like the rest of my body cannot survive, but the brain can continue on that robot. Is it me or, a machine at that time? Which one?
Those are big questions which we're not going to answer now. And maybe not in your lifetime. But
so thanks a lot, I think, for this one. I think probably it was the longest one. Yeah, if there is nothing else we can, we talk essentially all questions, suggestions for higher for women and everything. And if there's nothing, we can, I think, end the things.
Okay, bye everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, and bye everyone.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for your time. It was great.